The wind howled through the empty estate as a stray dog limped toward the mansion's grand entrance. Clenched between its teeth was a tattered, ancient box. Inside lay something that would shake the Millionaire'S world forever. The night was restless, the wind battering against the tall glass windows of the mansion perched on the outskirts of town. Inside, Thomas Sinclair sat alone in his study, the dim glow of a whiskey tumbler catching the flickering light of the fireplace. His hands, calloused from years of hard work, now trembled slightly as he traced the rim of the glass with his thumb. Outside, the rain drummed relentlessly, as if mocking the silence within. Wealth had granted Thomas everything: power, influence, the kind of status that turned whispers into applause. And yet, in the suffocating quiet of his vast estate, the echoes of his past rang louder than the ticking of the antique clock mounted on the wall. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. There was something in the air tonight, something heavier than the storm brewing beyond the stained-glass doors. On the far corner of his desk, an old pocket watch lay untouched, its golden frame dulled by time. It had been his father's, a relic of a past Thomas had spent decades trying to forget. The watch had once meant everything to him, a symbol of the man he had tried to live up to, a man who had built an empire with blood and sweat. But over the years, that admiration had soured into resentment. His father had never understood that money could never mend what had been broken. Thomas swallowed the last of his drink and stood, the weight of exhaustion dragging at his limbs. He had long accepted that some ghosts could never be exorcised. But just as he reached for the light switch, a sound cut through the storm, faint at first, then growing louder, a rhythmic, desperate scratching against the front door. His brow furrowed. The estate was secluded, miles away from the city. No one ever came uninvited. Yet the sound persisted, followed by a low, guttural whine. A dog. Thomas hesitated, his fingers tightening around the door handle before he pulled it open. There, standing in the rain, was a stray. Its fur was matted, slick with mud and rainwater. Its ribs jutted out beneath its skin, evidence of weeks, maybe months of starvation. But it wasn't the dog's gaunt appearance that made Thomas pause. It was what it held between its teeth. A small, tattered bundle wrapped in faded cloth. The dog's eyes, dull yet oddly pleading, locked onto his. It took a shaky step forward and gently placed the object at Thomas's feet before collapsing onto the cold marble floor. Thunder rumbled overhead. Thomas inhaled sharply, his pulse quickening as he crouched down. His fingers brushed the damp fabric of the bundle. It was soft, delicate, too delicate for something abandoned in the storm. And then, as he carefully peeled back the layers, his breath hitched in his throat. Inside, wrapped in the soaked cloth, was something he never expected to see again. For a long moment, Thomas just stared. Rain pelted the open doorway, wind clawing at the fabric draped around the mysterious object. His breath was shallow, his hands frozen above it, reluctant to peel back the rest. There was an eerie familiarity to its sensation that twisted deep in his gut. Swallowing hard, he forced himself to move. Gently, he unraveled the damp cloth, his fingers trembling slightly. And then, in the dim glow of the hallway chandelier, he saw it. A box. Small, wooden, and aged beyond reason, its edges chipped and worn as though it had traveled through time itself. Strange carvings ran along its surface, symbols he didn't recognize, though they stirred something buried deep in his memory. His pulse pounded. He had seen this before. But where? His throat tightened as he reached for it. The second his fingers made contact, a sharp chill ran up his spine. The box was unnaturally cold, despite being wrapped in layers of fabric and exposed to the storm. He lifted it carefully, weighing it in his palm. It was lighter than he expected, yet something inside shifted a faint rattle, like a whisper from the past. The dog whimpered at his feet, its frail body shivering uncontrollably. Thomas blinked, momentarily breaking free from the box's strange pull. The animal's breathing was labored, its ribs rising and falling in uneven tremors. Whatever journey had led it here had drained the last of its strength. A rare pang of sympathy struck him. Kneeling beside the creature, he hesitated before placing a hesitant hand on its soaked fur. The dog barely flinched, only pressing its head against the marble floor with a faint sigh. "What the hell were you carrying?" Thomas muttered under his breath, his gaze flicking between the dog and the enigmatic box. A million thoughts fought for dominance in his mind. Was this a coincidence? A simple act of fate that brought a stray dog to his doorstep carrying something peculiar? Or was it something else entirely? The rational part of him scoffed at the thought. He had spent his life grounded in reality, in cold, hard logic. And yet, something about this didn't sit right. Thunder roared overhead. The storm wasn't letting up, and the dog wouldn't survive much longer in this condition. With a sigh, Thomas scooped the animal into his arms, surprised by how little it weighed. It barely stirred, too weak to resist. Carrying both the dog and the box, he stepped inside, kicking the door shut against the relentless wind. The warmth of the mansion's interior wrapped around him, but it did little to settle the unease creeping into his bones. As he carried the dog toward the fireplace, a single thought looped in his mind. Something about that box was wrong, and for the first time in years, Thomas Sinclair felt a flicker of fear. The storm outside showed no signs of mercy. Rain lashed against the towering windows of Thomas Sinclair's estate, the howling wind a relentless force battering the walls. But inside, an even greater unease settled in the pit of his stomach. The dog lay curled near the fireplace, its frail body rising and falling with shallow breaths. Wrapped in a thick blanket, it barely stirred, exhausted beyond comprehension. Thomas had done what little he could. He had dried it off, given it some water, even laid out some scraps of food. But his mind wasn't on the dog. It was on the box. It sat on the marble coffee table, its dark carvings flickering in the firelight. Despite the warmth of the room, a thin mist of condensation clung to its surface, as if it refused to acclimate to its surroundings, as if it came from somewhere else entirely. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying the object with narrowed eyes. He had seen it before, he was sure of it. But the memory dangled just out of reach, buried beneath decades of forgotten recollections. A drink. He needed a drink. Rising, he strode toward the bar cart in the corner of the room, pouring himself 2 fingers of whiskey. The amber liquid swirled in the glass as he took a slow sip, eyes never leaving the box. Then, movement. Not from the dog. From the box. Thomas stilled. A slow, almost imperceptible shift, like the wood was breathing, expanding, contracting. It was subtle, but it was there. His grip on the glass tightened. His mind warred between reason and paranoia. Maybe it was the fire's reflection playing tricks on him. Maybe he was exhausted. Maybe a knock at the door shattered the silence. His head snapped up, heartbeat pounding. It was nearly midnight. Who the hell would be at his door at this hour? Setting down the glass, he moved toward the entrance, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous hall. He hesitated before opening it. The storm outside howled through the gap as soon as he pulled the door open. And there, standing on his doorstep, drenched in rain, was Dr. Elias Carter. Thomas's frown deepened. He hadn't spoken to the vet in months, not since their last business deal had fallen apart. Elias looked pale, his face drawn, his eyes darting past Thomas into the house. "You need to let me in," Elias said, his voice urgent, breathless. "Now." Thomas didn't move. "What the hell are you doing here?" Elias wiped rain from his face, stepping forward as if to force his way inside. "That dog," he gestured behind Thomas. "Where did you find it?" A sliver of unease crept through Thomas's spine. "It found me," he said carefully. "Why?" Elias exhaled sharply, his expression darkening. "Because if it's the same dog I think it is, you're in danger." He turned back to Elias. "What does this have to do with me?" Elias hesitated. "We think whoever stole the dog and the box, they knew you. They wanted you to have it." A beat of silence. Then, "That's impossible," Thomas snapped. Elias didn't back down. "Is it?" Thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the windows. For the first time in years, Thomas felt truly unmoored. His life had been built on structure, control, order. This was chaos knocking at his door. And yet, deep in his gut, something told him Elias wasn't lying. The vet took a cautious step forward, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, Thomas. That box, it isn't just old, it's wrong. We ran tests on the material, carbon dating, radiographic imaging, and nothing made sense. It didn't match anything we'd seen before. It was like it shouldn't even exist." Thomas's pulse quickened, but he masked it well. "That's absurd." Elias's expression darkened. "Then open it." Thomas froze. The challenge hung in the air between them, heavy as stone. He had considered it, of course he had. The moment he unwrapped the cloth, the temptation had slithered into his mind like a whisper in the dark. Open it, see what's inside. And yet, something had stopped him. A deeper instinct, one he hadn't felt since he was a child. An unshakable certainty that whatever was inside was not meant for him. Not meant for anyone. His fingers twitched at his sides. "I don't." A sound cut through the room like a knife. A click. Both men turned. The box. It had shifted, just slightly. The lid, which had been perfectly shut, was now slightly ajar. Elias paled. "Oh no!" The temperature in the room dropped. A low, almost imperceptible whisper drifted from the box, though it had no source, no origin. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't even sound. It was something else entirely. A presence. The dog let out a sharp, strangled whimper. Its frail body shuddered violently, as if sensing something neither man could. Then something moved. Not in the room. Inside the box. Thomas staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. The world around him blurred at the edges, everything slowing as his body reacted before his mind could catch up. His instincts screamed at him to close it, to throw it into the fire, to destroy it. But it was too late. A thin sliver of darkness slithered from the gap in the lid, curling into the air like ink spreading through water. It pulsed almost, watching. The fireplace flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the room. Elias's voice was barely a whisper. "You should not have touched it." And then, the lights went out. The storm raged on outside, but inside the Sinclair estate, a new kind of terror had taken root. And Thomas Sinclair was no longer the one in control. The weight of those words settled between them. Thomas had known Elias for years. He was a man of science, of logic, not prone to theatrics. And yet, standing there in the rain, he looked shaken to his core. Thomas stepped aside without another word. The moment Elias entered, he locked the door behind him. Dripping water onto the polished floor, Elias made his way toward the fireplace, eyes instantly locking onto the dog. His reaction was immediate. He recoiled slightly, like he had been struck. Thomas studied him carefully. "Tell me what's going on." Elias didn't look at him. "Where's the box?" The hair on Thomas's arm stood on end. Slowly, he gestured to the coffee table. Elias turned, his expression unreadable, and then, without hesitation, he stepped forward and placed a trembling hand on the surface of the box. The second his fingers brushed the wood, a strange sound filled the room, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrating through the air. Thomas felt it too. Elias pulled his hand away like he had been burned. His face had gone pale. "You need to get rid of this," he whispered. Thomas's patience snapped. "Enough with the theatrics, Elias. Tell me what the hell is going on." The vet turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "That dog?" He nodded toward the creature curled near the fire. "It disappeared 3 weeks ago, from a research facility." Thomas's blood ran cold. "What kind of facility?" he asked. Elias hesitated. "The kind that shouldn't exist." The storm raged outside, but inside, an even greater tempest was brewing. And Thomas Sinclair was beginning to realize he had just become part of something far, far bigger than himself. Thomas's grip on the back of the armchair tightened. The warmth of the whiskey in his stomach did nothing to ease the cold that had settled in his chest. "A research facility," he repeated, his voice eerily calm. "And you're telling me this dog, this half-dead stray, escaped from it?" Elias didn't blink. "Not escaped. Taken." Silence. The fireplace crackled softly behind them, shadows flickering across the walls, dancing over the carved symbols on the box. Thomas's jaw clenched. "You think I stole the damn thing?" he scoffed. Elias shook his head. "Not you, but someone did, and they wanted you to find it." Thomas exhaled through his nose, trying to suppress the surge of frustration threatening to boil over. "This is insane. You're talking in riddles. Just tell me what you know." Elias's hands twitched at his sides. His gaze flicked back to the dog, then to the box, then back to Thomas. And then, finally, he spoke. 3 weeks ago, the facility was breached. The dog was taken along with a handful of other items. A muscle in Thomas's jaw ticked. "What kind of items?" Elias hesitated. "Biological specimens. Objects of unknown origin. things we didn't fully understand. Thomas laughed dryly, but there was no humor in it. You're being deliberately cryptic. You're telling me this thing, he gestured toward the dog, was part of some illegal experiment? Elias didn't respond. That was answer enough. The weight in Thomas's chest grew heavier. His gaze slid back to the box. That gnawing familiarity clawed at him again, dragging at the edges of his memory like an old wound being reopened. Darkness swallowed the room. Thomas's breath came quick and shallow, his ears straining against the suffocating silence that followed. The storm outside howled, rattling the windows, but inside the estate it was deathly still save for the whisper. Not a sound, not a voice, but something far worse. A presence. It curled through the air, unseen yet undeniable, threading through the cold space between Thomas and Elias. The fireplace, moments ago a roaring comfort, had dwindled to a sickly flicker, its light struggling against the suffocating black. Thomas's pulse pounded against his ribs. He had never believed in ghosts, in curses, in things beyond explanation. But at this moment, standing in the void that had consumed his home, logic abandoned him. Elias's voice was barely a breath. Don't move. But Thomas already had. His instincts propelled him backward, away from the coffee table where the cursed box still sat, open, leaking something unseen into the world. The dog let out a strangled whimper. And then, a shift. Not in the room. Not in the house. In reality itself. Thomas felt it like the air had been sucked from his lungs, like the walls had stretched, bent, distorted. For a split second, he wasn't in his own home anymore. The walls pulsed with something ancient, something watching, and then the whisper turned into a voice. Not human, not alive, but speaking. His name, Thomas Sinclair. A force slammed into him, knocking him to his knees. The whisper dug into his skull, threading into his thoughts, weaving through his memories as though flipping through pages of his life. Elias stumbled back, hand flying to his ears. You need to. A deafening crack split through the room. The fireplace roared back to life, flames stretching unnaturally high, casting jagged shadows against the walls. And in the center of it all, the box stood untouched, unmoved, yet its lid had fully opened now, revealing nothing. Just darkness. A void. Something that should not be. Thomas pushed himself up on shaking limbs. What the hell is happening? Elias's face was drawn, sweat beating at his temples. You need to shut it. Now. But Thomas couldn't move. The shadows slithering from the box pulsed, almost breathing, curling toward him like fingers reaching from the depths of the unknown. And in them, just for a second, he saw something. Not a shape. Not a creature. A memory. His father's study. The smell of aged books and bourbon. The weight of expectation crushing his shoulders. And there, on the desk, partially hidden beneath old documents, the same damn box. His breath hitched. Number. It wasn't possible. He had never seen it before, had he? Memories warred in his head, some sharp, some fragmented, as if they had been tampered with, erased and rewritten. He remembered sitting in that study as a boy, watching his father's weathered hands trace the carvings on the wood, whispering under his breath. He remembered the way his father's face had darkened the night before his sudden death, how his last words to Thomas had been nothing but a hoarse warning. Some doors should never be opened. And yet, he had opened it. The realization sent a surge of ice through his veins. This was no coincidence. The box had belonged to his father, and now it had come back for him. Elias grabbed his arm, shaking him. Thomas, shut it, before. Too late. The room lurched. The shadows around them stretched, expanded, swallowing the ceiling, the walls, the furniture. Thomas felt something tighten around his chest, not physical, but something far worse. A pressure. A presence. It was here, and it was waking up. The walls trembled. The very air in the room seemed to pulse, thick with something unseen, something ancient. Thomas gasped as the pressure around him grew unbearable, like unseen hands pressing against his chest, his ribs creaking under the force. Elias stumbled back, his face twisted in sheer panic. We need to close it now, he yelled, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the whispering. It was everywhere. Not just in the air, not just in Thomas's head. It was in the walls, the floor, the very bones of the house. Thomas Sinclair. Table. A guttural snarl ripped through the room. The frail, half-starved creature suddenly wasn't weak anymore. It was something else, something fierce. Teeth bared, it snapped at the encroaching void, its body twisting as if shielding Thomas from whatever was trying to consume him. A deafening shriek ripped through the air. The shadows recoiled. Thomas gasped, yanking his arm free. The moment the connection broke, the weight in the air lifted just slightly. Elias didn't waste time. He lunged forward, grabbed the lid of the box and slammed it shut. The effect was instant. The whispering stopped. The air thinned. The fireplace roared back to full flame, casting harsh golden light across the room. The house breathed again. Thomas lay sprawled on the floor, his chest heaving. The dog stood beside him, fur bristling, its dark eyes locked onto the now-sealed box. Elias was panting, his hand still gripping the box's lid like he expected it to fight back. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then finally, Elias whispered, "It marked you." Thomas swallowed hard, still staring at the box, at the intricate carvings that now seemed even darker than before. "What?" Elias exhaled shakily. "Your father, he knew. He tried to stop it. That's why he died." He turned to Thomas, his expression grave. "And now it wants you." The storm outside raged on, and Thomas Sinclair realized this wasn't over. Not even close. The voice slithered into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like smoke. It was neither male nor female, neither human nor beast. It was something other, something that knew him. He clenched his jaw, shaking his head violently, trying to force the thing out. But the memories it pulled from him came faster now, unraveling like frayed threads in his mind. His father. The late nights spent in that dimly lit study, the old man hunched over his desk, muttering over yellowed pages filled with symbols Thomas couldn't read. The warnings. "Never open what you don't understand, son. Some doors don't just open, they invite." And yet, he had opened it. The whispering escalated into something worse. Laughter. Not human, not natural. Thomas turned to the box now, the void sitting atop the coffee table, and his breath hitched in his throat. Something was looking back at him. A presence, deeper than black, darker than night itself. It wasn't a shape, nor a figure, but the absence of both. The longer he stared, the more it seemed to stretch, reaching, twisting toward him like it had been waiting for this moment. A tendril of that darkness slithered forward. Thomas barely had time to move before it wrapped around his wrist. Searing cold shot through his veins. He let out a strangled gasp as his knees buckled, his vision flickering. And suddenly, he wasn't in his home anymore. A memory. Number, not a memory. A moment from the past playing out in real time. He stood in his father's study, but everything was wrong. The air smelled of old parchment and dying embers, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the outside world. The desk was cluttered with ancient books, cryptic symbols scrawled in ink-stained pages. And there at the center of it all, his father. John Sinclair sat hunched over the very same box, its carvings almost glowing beneath the flickering lamplight. He looked older than Thomas remembered, his face gaunt, his hands trembling as he traced the markings. He was whispering. Thomas took a step forward. "Dad?" His father's head snapped up. His eyes, God, his eyes. Thomas recoiled. They weren't the eyes of the man he had known. They were hollow, empty. No note empty. Something else was looking through them. John Sinclair opened his mouth, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It always chooses the bloodline. A sudden boom echoed through the study. The walls shuddered. Books fell from their shelves. Thomas staggered back, heart pounding. "What the hell is this?" "Jono," the thing inside John tilted its head, those dead eyes locking onto Thomas. "We have waited, Thomas." The floor cracked beneath him. "Your father tried to resist. You will not." The shadows surged forward. And Thomas fell. He hit the floor of his study with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. The present. The now. The box sat open. The void still stretched toward him. Elias was shouting something, but it was distant, muffled, like a voice underwater. The darkness was still wrapped around Thomas's wrist, its cold seeping into his bones. Then, the dog moved. With a sudden jolt, the stray who had been motionless until now lunged toward the coffee. The storm outside had begun to fade, but inside the Sinclair estate, the air was still thick with something unseen, something lingering. Thomas sat on the cold marble floor, his back against the heavy wooden desk. His wrist still ached where the shadow had touched him, though no mark remained. The dog lay beside him, its breathing steady but its dark eyes locked on the closed box, as if expecting it to spring open again. Elias stood across the room, one hand braced against the fireplace mantel, his head bowed as he caught his breath. For a long time neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened hung between them, suffocating, unspoken. Thomas finally broke the silence. His voice was hoarse, raw. "What the hell was that?" Elias looked up, his face pale. "You already know, don't you?" Thomas swallowed. He did. Not entirely, not in a way he could explain, but deep in his bones, in the part of him that had never stopped being that little boy watching his father whisper to things in the dark, he knew. His father had been keeping something at bay, and now it was his turn. His hands curled into fists against his knees. "You said it marked me." Elias hesitated. "It's complicated." Thomas laughed dryly, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, by all means simplify it for me." Elias sighed, running a hand down his face. He looked exhausted, like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. "You've heard stories of cursed objects, right? Artifacts that seem to want something? Things that leave behind an imprint?" Thomas nodded stiffly. Elias gestured toward the box. "This isn't just cursed. It's alive. Not in the way we understand life. Not flesh and blood. But something else. It doesn't just exist, it chooses. It watches. It waits." Thomas's throat tightened. "It latched onto your father," Elias continued, his voice low, "and now it's latched onto you." A cold dread settled over Thomas's chest. "My father," he murmured. "He tried to get rid of it, didn't he?" Elias hesitated. Then, yes. Thomas's jaw clenched. His father had known. He had spent his last years consumed by something Thomas had been too blind to see. And now, decades later, the box had found its way back. And this time it wasn't letting go. The fire crackled, casting long shadows along the walls. The dog stirred beside him, its ears twitching. Thomas exhaled shakily, his breath fogging slightly in the suddenly chilled air. "So what happens now?" Elias didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was grim. "You have two choices." Thomas glanced up. Elias's expression was unreadable, but his tone left no room for doubt. "You can ignore it, pretend this never happened, hope it fades." Thomas felt the but before Elias even said it. Or? Elias's gaze flickered toward the box, his jaw tightened. "Or you do what your father never could." Silence. Thomas didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. Destroy it. Burn it. Break it. End whatever had begun decades ago. But some small, dark part of him whispered that it wouldn't be that easy. That the thing inside the box, the thing that had spoken his name in the dark, wasn't afraid of fire. He let his head fall back against the desk, staring up at the ceiling. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like an anchor. The storm had passed. But the real battle was only beginning. The sun was rising when Thomas and Elias finally left the cabin. The night's horrors still clung to the air, but there was something different, now something lighter. The oppressive weight, the suffocating presence, it was gone. The forest, which had been eerily silent before, had come back to life. Leaves rustled in the wind, birds chirped in the distance, and the world, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, felt real again. Thomas leaned against the car, staring at the old structure behind him, the place where his father had made his greatest mistake, the place where he had almost followed the same path, but not anymore. Elias stood beside him, his arms crossed. He was exhausted, his face drawn, but his eyes held something Thomas hadn't seen in them before. Relief. Thomas let out a slow breath. "It's over." Elias didn't look at him. He kept his gaze locked on the cabin, as if making sure the nightmare wouldn't crawl back out. "Maybe." Thomas frowned. "Maybe?" Elias finally turned to him. "We shut the box. We sent it back. But things like this, they don't just end, Thomas. You of all people should know that." Thomas's hands clenched at his sides. You think it'll come back?" Elias was silent for a moment. Then, "I think something always does." The words sent a chill down Thomas's spine, but he forced himself to shake it off. The box was locked. The ritual was complete. Whatever had haunted his family for generations was gone. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elias was right. Some doors, once opened, never truly close. The dog stirred beside him, nudging his hand. Thomas looked down, exhaling. "At least we made it out." Elias let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, barely." Thomas knelt, running a hand through the dog's fur. "You saved my life," he murmured. The dog blinked up at him, dark eyes holding something deep, something that almost felt human. Elias watched quietly. "You're keeping it, aren't you?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "Yeah." Elias shook his head. "Figures." Thomas smirked slightly. "After everything we've been through, I think we've earned each other." Elias didn't argue. He just sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "So what now?" Thomas looked back at the cabin one last time, the place where his father had fallen, the place where he had almost followed. Then he turned away. "We go home." And with that, he opened the car door, the dog jumping in beside him. Elias slid into the passenger seat, and as the engine roared to life, Thomas didn't look back. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from the past. He was driving towards something new, and whatever came next, that was ready. Some stories are meant to be told. Others, they're meant to stay buried. Thomas Sinclair learned the hard way that some doors should never be opened. But what about you? If a mystery landed on your doorstep, would you have the courage to face it, or would you walk away? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more gripping tales. Who knows? The next one might just be waiting for you. The storm outside had long since passed, leaving only the soft dripping of water from the eaves of the mansion. But inside, the air still pulsed with something unnatural. Thomas sat on the floor, his mind warring between exhaustion and the growing realization that he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't walk away from. The box sealed shut once again remained on the table, but its presence was oppressive, like a heartbeat in the dark. Elias was pacing. "We can't just leave it here," he muttered. "This thing, it's not done with you." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, the weight of Elias's words sinking into his bones. "And you think destroying it will be that simple?" Elias hesitated. No, Thomas realized, he doesn't. His father had tried, had spent years trying, and in the end, it had still claimed him. Thomas pushed himself up, rubbing at his wrist where the shadow had coiled around him. It still felt cold, like the memory of ice. "You've studied this thing. You must have some idea how to stop it." Elias looked at him, something unreadable in his expression. "It's not just the box, Thomas. It's you." Thomas frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Elias exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "These things, cursed objects, artifacts with energy attached to them, they don't work randomly. They choose. And this one," he nodded toward the box, "has been following your bloodline for a long time." Thomas's stomach turned. "Because of my father?" Elias shook his head. "Because of whatever he did." Silence stretched between them. Thomas's father had always been a man of secrets, a man with locked doors and whispered conversations. But whatever had started with him had now bled into Thomas's life. And there was no running from it. His fists clenched. "Then tell me how to end it." Elias hesitated for only a second before saying, "We take it back." Thomas stilled. "Back where?" Elias swallowed. "Where your father found it." A pit opened in Thomas's stomach. "You know where that is?" Elias nodded grimly. "It took years to track down. But yes." Thomas glanced at the box, bile rising in his throat. Whatever was inside it, whatever had spoken his name, wasn't meant for this world. And if they were going to survive, they had to send it back. The trip was made in silence. Thomas drove, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. Elias sat beside him, the box wrapped in cloth on his lap, as if trying to keep it contained. The dog who had refused to leave Thomas's side curled up in the back seat. It hadn't made a sound since they left the house, but its eyes never left the box. The destination wasn't far. A cabin, deep in the woods beyond the Sinclair estate. Thomas had never been there before, but the moment he pulled onto the overgrown path leading to it, a strange déjà vu settled over him, as if some part of him remembered. The house was old, rotting, half consumed by the forest, as if the earth itself had been trying to bury it. Elias exhaled slowly. "This is it." Thomas swallowed hard. "This is where he found it?" Elias nodded. "Where he took it." Thunder rumbled in the distance. Thomas stepped out of the car, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The woods were deathly silent. No wind, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. The dog followed close behind him as he approached the cabin, its ears flat against its head. Thomas hesitated at the threshold. The door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted, its wood warped from years of neglect. He reached for it, and the moment his fingers brushed the surface, a whisper crawled through his mind. "Welcome home." His breath hitched. The dog growled low in its throat. Thomas shook himself, pushing the door open with a sharp creak. Inside, dust motes swirled in the dim light filtering through shattered windows. The walls were covered in old, brittle pages notes, drawings, symbols he didn't understand. And at the center of it all, a circle, scorched into the wood. A place for the box. Elias stepped in behind him, his expression tight. "Your father didn't just find the box, Thomas." Thomas woke up gasping, his body jerking violently back into the present. The cabin swayed around him, the air thick with the suffocating presence of something else. Elias was shouting. "Thomas, read the words no?" Thomas's gaze snapped down to the page. His fingers tightened around the parchment. The box was open. The darkness inside it was stretching, twisting toward him, tendrils of nothingness reaching for his skin. The dog leapt forward, biting at the shadows. It was now or never. Thomas forced his mouth open and spoke. The words burned his tongue. The air screamed. The walls of the cabin shook. The symbols around him glowed, burning hot white against the wood. The shadows reeled back, hissing, recoiling as the ritual took hold. Thomas kept reading, his voice growing stronger with every syllable. The more he spoke, the angrier the presence became. The darkness lashed out, and the dog leapt into the circle. A horrible, twisting sound filled the room. And then, the box slammed shut. The pressure in the air snapped, like a cord had been cut. The darkness vanished. The room was silent. Thomas gasped, his entire body shaking. His knees hit the floor. Elias slumped back against the wall, breathing hard. "Holy?" But Thomas wasn't listening. His gaze was locked on the dog. The creature lay in the center of the burned circle, completely still. Thomas's stomach dropped. He scrambled forward. No, 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 no. His hands hovered over the frail body, his chest tightening. The dog had been there from the beginning, had fought beside him. And now, its sides rose, a slow, steady breath. And then, it opened its eyes. Thomas let out a shaking breath. The dog blinked up at him, then slowly, weakly pressed its head into his palm. Thomas closed his eyes, exhaling in relief. It was over. The box was shut. The presence was gone. For the first time in his life, he was free. Thomas turned to him, his pulse hammering. Elias's voice was grim. He summoned it. Thomas stared at Elias, the words he summoned it ringing in his head like a death knell. His father, John Sinclair, hadn't just been a man haunted by secrets. He had been the architect of his own damnation. The shadows in the cabin felt heavier now, pressing in from every corner. The box sat tightly wrapped in cloth in Elias's hands, but it was pulsing, not visibly, not physically. But Thomas could feel it, like a second heartbeat vibrating in the air. His hands curled into fists. "What do we do?" Elias exhaled. "We put it back." He stepped toward the burned symbol on the floor, kneeling carefully. He unwrapped the cloth, revealing the ancient, cursed thing that had ruined generations of Sinclairs. The carvings along the edges looked even darker now, as if something inside had woken up the moment they crossed the threshold. Thomas took a step closer, his pulse thrumming in his ears. The box was waiting. The dog let out a low growl behind him. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, crumpled page filled with symbols that matched the ones on the walls. "Your father must have found these. He had a way to summon it, which means there has to be a way to send it back," Thomas finished. Elias nodded grimly. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and for a split second, Thomas swore he heard laughter riding the wind. It was mocking them, testing them. He swallowed hard. What do I do? Elias handed him the page. You read it, word for word. This is the counter ritual, I think. If your father opened a door, then this will shut it. Thomas looked down at the symbols. His stomach twisted. The words on the page weren't just ink on paper, they moved, shifted, twisted like living things, writhing beneath his gaze. The back of his neck prickled. His father had read this, had spoken these very words, and he had failed. Thomas exhaled sharply. He wasn't his father. He could end this. He dropped to one knee beside the burned circle, planting his hands on the floor. The old wood was ice cold beneath his palms. The weight of unseen things pressed against his shoulders, heavy as stone. He opened his mouth, and the lights went out. The fire in the fireplace died in an instant. The darkness surged forward, slamming into the room like a living storm. Elias staggered back with a shout. The dog barked furiously, snapping at the shadows that oozed from the box like liquid night. The whispering returned, but this time it wasn't subtle. It was deafening. Thomas Sinclair. The voice wrapped around his mind like a noose. His lungs seized, his vision blurred. And then he wasn't in the cabin anymore. A memory. Number A vision. He stood in his childhood home, the study lit only by the glow of candlelight. Papers were strewn across the desk, and there, hunched over the very same box, his father. John Sinclair's hands trembled as he pressed his palms flat against the wood, his face drenched in sweat. Thomas stepped forward, his voice caught in his throat. Dad? His father didn't respond, didn't move. Then, slowly, his head turned. Thomas froze. His father's eyes were wrong. Black, empty, not human. And when he spoke, the voice wasn't his own. You should not have come back. The shadows surged,